The summer of his 38th year arrived the way all hard years do, without announcement, without mercy, settling over Cedarwood Hills like a wet wool blanket that no breeze could lift. Nathan Cole had learned not to check the weather app anymore. The forecast had read the same for 11 consecutive days. High of 97 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity 84%. No relief expected. Knowing the number did nothing to change the fact that by 6 in the morning, the air already tasted like copper and engine exhaust, and the short walk from his apartment building to the parking lot left a dark crescent of sweat along the collar of his gray work shirt before he even reached his truck. He'd bought the truck used 3 years ago from a lot on Route 9 that specialized in vehicles with dubious histories and optimistic sticker prices. The air conditioning had died in April. He hadn't had the money to fix it. He drove with both windows down and told his daughter, Lily, that it was more fun that way, like being on a boat. Lily was 8 years old and understood approximately 90% of his lies, but she let him have most of them. This particular Tuesday, she sat in the passenger seat with her knees pulled to her chest and a damp cloth pressed against the back of her neck, which Nathan had folded and soaked under the kitchen tap before they left. She hadn't slept well. Neither had he. The apartment's window unit had made a grinding sound at 2 in the morning. Shuddered like something dying and gone quiet. He'd lain on top of the covers in the dark and listened to Lily's breathing and done the math in his head, the way he did every night, what was coming in, what was going out, where the gap was, how wide. The gap was wide. He worked maintenance at Voss Technologies, a mid-sized firm that had recently been acquired by a larger conglomerate and was now in the middle of the kind of corporate reorganization that made everyone in the building walk a little faster and talk a little softer. His job was to keep the building running. HVAC filters, lighting panels, plumbing emergencies, the loading dock's temperamental hydraulic gate. It was work he was good at. He'd grown up watching his father fix things, engines, fences, broken furniture, and had inherited both the patience and the intuition for it. His hands knew what to do before his mind caught up. The pay was $23.50 an hour. It was not enough. He also drove for a delivery service on Thursday and Friday evenings and most of Saturday, pushing through the hours between 5 and midnight with a phone mount on the dashboard and a cooler of energy drinks on the passenger floor. That brought in another $800 a month, variable. Between the two, he was covering rent, the school fees, Lily's asthma medication, and the minimum payment on the credit card that had absorbed her ER visit last winter. His mother helped when she could. She lived 40 minutes away and watched Lily on the days he worked late. She was 63 and had her own bills. He didn't ask for more than she offered. There was no one else. Lily's mother had left when Lily was 2, which was a story Nathan had long ago decided wasn't worth telling in detail, not because it still hurt in a sharp, immediate way, but because the telling of it never seemed to change anything. She was somewhere in Portland now, last he heard. She sent a card at Christmas sometimes. Lily had stopped asking about her the way children eventually stop asking about things the adults in their lives go quiet around. The disease that had been circling Lily for the past 3 weeks had started as a low-grade fever, 99.8, nothing alarming, and a persistent cough that her pediatrician attributed to summer allergens and told Nathan to watch. He had watched it. He was still watching. The cough was worse in the morning. The fever had spiked twice in the last week, once to 101.4, once to 102.1. Each time, he'd given her children's ibuprofen, sat beside her bed, and watched the medication work its slow, imperfect miracle. He'd called the pediatrician again on Monday. They could see her Thursday. Thursday was 2 days away. He turned into the Voss Technologies employee lot at 7:52, which meant he was 8 minutes late, which meant Raymond Holt, his floor supervisor, would be waiting for him near the maintenance bay with that particular expression, not quite angry, more like a man who had been personally wronged by the concept of tardiness and had been collecting evidence against it for years. Nathan parked. He looked at Lily. She had fallen asleep against the window in the last 10 minutes of the drive, her mouth slightly open, the damp cloth fallen into her lap. He sat for a moment longer than he should have. Then he texted his mother, dropping Lily now. "She's running warm again." Doc Apt Thursday lifted his daughter gently, carried her to the back seat of his mother's Civic, which was idling in the fire lane as agreed, kissed Lily's hair, and walked across the parking lot into the building. Raymond was waiting exactly where Nathan knew he would be. 8:53, Raymond said, without looking up from his clipboard. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, with a meticulous part in his hair and the disposition of someone who had been passed over for promotion enough times to convert the disappointment into institutional loyalty. "That's the second time this month, Cole. My daughter was running a fever. Every employee in this building has a life, Nathan." "That's not what I'm clocking." There were 3 other maintenance workers nearby, 2 of them pretending to be occupied with equipment. One of them, Marcus Webb, watching with open curiosity. Nathan felt the familiar geometry of public humiliation. The fluorescent lights, the concrete floor, the eyes he could feel without meeting. He didn't say anything else. He took the clipboard Raymond offered, checked his assignments for the day, and went to work. He would think about that decision later, the silence, the surrender, and wonder whether it was wisdom or exhaustion or something else he didn't have a word for yet. Voss Technologies occupied 6 floors of a building that had been renovated 3 years prior into the kind of workspace that appeared in architecture magazines. Exposed ductwork painted matte black, collaborative pods upholstered in forest green, floor-to-ceiling glass on the upper floors, so that the whole city seemed to tilt slightly when you walked past. Nathan worked mostly in the basement and on floors 2 and 3, which were not the floors that appeared in the magazine photos, but he moved through the whole building, because broken things did not restrict themselves to photogenic levels. He was replacing a ballast in a light fixture on the 4th floor at 10:30 when the elevator opened and the air in the hallway changed. He would not have been able to explain this sensation precisely, if asked. It wasn't a scent or a sound. It was more like barometric pressure, the feeling of a room recalibrating around a new center of gravity. He looked down from the stepladder. She was walking with 2 people half a step behind her, a woman in a blazer holding a tablet, a man in a suit with a phone already raised, and she was not walking quickly, exactly, but at a pace that suggested the speed of everything around her was insufficient. She wore a slate-gray dress that fit with the precision of something built rather than purchased, and her dark hair was pulled back at the neck. She was perhaps 35, 36. Her face, at a distance, was the kind of face that had learned not to give things away. He knew who she was. Everyone in the building knew who she was. Alexandra Mercer, CEO of Meridian Group, the conglomerate that had absorbed Voss Technologies 4 months ago and was now in the process of deciding which parts of the acquisition were worth keeping. She had appeared in the building twice before Nathan had heard about both visits secondhand, the way you hear about weather events in other cities. Today, apparently, was the 3rd time. She walked the length of the hallway without looking at him. He went back to the ballast. He was down from the ladder, collecting his tools, when he heard Raymond's voice around the corner pitched differently than it was when he talked to maintenance staff, with a softness in the consonants that Nathan associated with men who had been trained to perform deference. He gathered his equipment bag and moved toward the freight elevator, which was the route he usually took to avoid foot traffic. He didn't quite make it. She came around the corner at the moment he was stepping aside to let the group pass, and their proximity was momentary 2 feet, maybe less, and in that proximity he became acutely aware of his gray work shirt with the Voss logo on the breast pocket and the line of sweat along his jaw and the utility bag in his hand and the overall condition of being a person who was clearly not supposed to be in this corridor at this specific intersection of time and space. She looked at him, not the look people gave maintenance workers, the practiced non-look, the visual slide that redirected to something more relevant. She actually looked at him, for perhaps 1.5 seconds, with eyes that were dark and calibrated and gave nothing back. Then she was past him, and Raymond was speaking again, and the hallway returned to its previous configuration. Nathan pressed the freight elevator button. His phone buzzed in his pocket. His mother, Lily's temp 101.8 again. Should I take her to urgent care? He stared at the screen for a long moment. Urgent care was $350 without insurance, and his insurance had a deductible he hadn't cleared. Give her ibuprofen and keep her cool, he typed. I'll call the pediatrician on my break. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. The doors closed on the hallway and everything in it. He didn't mean to fall asleep in the server room. He'd been sent down to floor B2 at 2:30 to check a ventilation unit that was running hot, not dangerous, but flagged by facilities management as a potential concern. The room was climate-controlled at 68 degrees, which was a 15-degree difference from the rest of the building, and felt, in the middle of this particular summer, something close to sacred. He'd checked the unit, diagnosed a partially obstructed intake filter, replaced it. The whole thing took 22 minutes. He sat down on the floor beside the equipment rack to make a note in his maintenance log. He had slept a combined 4 hours over the previous 2 nights. The ibuprofen he'd taken at lunch for the headache behind his eyes had the secondary effect of making him slightly drowsy. The temperature in the room was 68 degrees. He closed his eyes for what he intended to be 30 seconds. He woke up 45 minutes later to his phone alarm, the one he'd set for his afternoon break, which he'd forgotten he'd set, and the first thing he felt, before the panic, was the cold. The second thing was the panic. He was on his feet in 2 seconds, checking the time, doing the calculation. He'd been gone from his rotation for over an hour. He grabbed his bag and went for the door, and found Raymond in the hallway outside, which was not a coincidence, because the door to B2 had a camera above it that fed to the facility's monitoring station, and Raymond had apparently been watching it. Raymond was not alone. Behind him, at a slight remove, stood Alexandra Mercer's assistant, the woman with the tablet, and behind her, Alexandra Mercer herself. Nathan understood, in the compressed second before anyone spoke, that this was a review visit, that they had been walking the building, that they had come to B2, that there was, on the monitoring feed, footage of a maintenance employee asleep on the floor of a server room. Raymond's expression was the expression of a man who had been handed a gift he wasn't sure how to use yet. "Mr. Cole," he said, "we've been looking for you." Nathan looked at Raymond. Then, because it felt like the honest thing to do, he looked past Raymond to Alexandra Mercer. She was watching him the way she'd watched him in the 4th-floor hallway, with that precise, evaluative attention that felt less like judgment than like measurement. She had a pen in her hand. She wasn't writing anything. "I fell asleep," Nathan said. "I'm aware of how that looks." "The camera," Raymond began. "I know what the camera shows." He kept his voice level. Not defensive, just accurate. "I've been working a second job most evenings. My daughter has been sick for 3 weeks. I sat down in a cold room for 30 seconds, and my body made a decision without consulting me. I'm not making excuses, I'm giving you context." The hallway was very quiet. He waited for whatever came next. His mother called at 4:15. He was on a ladder on the 3rd floor, replacing a section of ceiling tile that had been damaged by a slow leak, when the phone buzzed in his pocket for the 3rd time in 40 minutes. The first 2 times had been texts he hadn't read yet. The 3rd time was a call. He came down from the ladder. "She's at 1029, his mother said. "Nathan, she's not keeping water down." He was already moving toward the stairwell. "Call Dr. Benning's after-hours line. Tell them the fever's been recurring for 3 weeks, and now she's vomiting." "What are you going to?" "I'm coming. I'll figure out the rest." He had his bag over his shoulder and was through the stairwell door when Raymond appeared at the end of the hallway. Nathan didn't slow down. "Cole, we're not done. My daughter needs to go to urgent care. I'm clocking out." Raymond said something else. Nathan was already down the first flight of stairs. He drove to his mother's with the windows down and both hands on the wheel, and his mind doing what it did in emergencies. going very still and very focused, sorting the list of what needed to happen in what order. Lily first. The rest after. The job would be what it would be. He couldn't manage that from the truck. Lily was sitting on his mother's couch under a light blanket with the expression of a child who was trying not to alarm the adults around her, which was the expression that always undid him most completely. She was pale, and her eyes were slightly glassy, and when she saw him she said, "I didn't want Mom, to call you at work," which was exactly the kind of thing she said. He sat beside her and put his hand on her forehead and her cheek and the side of her neck. Then he looked at his mother. "We're going," he said. Urgent care was $350. He had $212 in his checking account. He put the balance on the credit card. The physician on duty examined Lily, ran a blood panel, determined it was a bacterial infection that had not been caught early enough, prescribed a course of antibiotics, and told Nathan that her temperature would need to be monitored closely for the next 48 hours, and that if it climbed above 103.5 he should go directly to the ER. He drove home with Lily in the back seat, the prescription filled, his daughter asleep with her head against the window, the credit card debt $350 wider than it had been that morning. He sat in the parking lot of his building for 10 minutes after she'd fallen asleep. Outside, the evening heat was still dense and close, the sky the color of old bronze. A neighbor's sprinkler ticked steadily across the building's thin strip of grass. Somewhere on the street, someone was grilling something, and the smell of it, ordinary, summer, human, was the thing that broke him open, briefly, in the privacy of his truck. He let it happen. He'd learned, in the years since he'd been doing this alone, that you could give yourself 5 minutes. Then he got his daughter out of the car and carried her upstairs. The summons arrived the next morning as a voicemail from a number he didn't recognize, left while he was in the shower. A woman's voice, crisp, measured, said that Miss Mercer would like to speak with Mr. Cole at 9 o'clock and that he should come to the 6th floor. He stood in his kitchen with his phone in his hand for a moment, then set it down and made Lily's breakfast. His mother had come to stay for the morning. Lily was better. The antibiotic had already taken the edge off the fever, and she'd slept through the night, but still fragile in the way children are when illness has visited. Quiet, slow to laugh, dependent in a way she usually kept carefully concealed. "Bah," she'd said that morning, using the shorthand she'd invented for Dad at age 3 and never abandoned. "Yeah. Are you going to lose your job?" He looked at her across the table. She was eating toast with too much butter, the way she preferred it, and watching him with those level eyes that sometimes startled him with how much they saw. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe." She nodded like this was something she'd already calculated. "We'll be okay, though. We'll be okay," he confirmed. She went back to her toast. He finished his coffee. The 6th floor was a different country. The maintenance workers didn't come up here except for emergencies. The ceiling was higher. The carpet was a different material, darker, denser, the kind that absorbed sound. The glass walls of the executive offices looked out over the city on 3 sides, and in the angled morning light, the whole floor had the quality of something suspended rather than built. He was met at the elevator by the woman with the tablet whose name was Claire, a detail he'd gathered from the voicemail signature, and walked to a corner office where the glass met the sky. Alexandra Mercer was standing at the window. She didn't turn when he came in. For a moment, he stood near the door, looking at the room, the clean desk, the single orchid on the windowsill, the city stretching away in every direction, heat already visible in the shimmer above the rooftops. Then she turned. In the natural light, she looked less assembled than she had in the hallway. Not softer. Exactly the precision was still there, in the set of her shoulders, in the way she occupied the room. But there were shadows under her eyes that the hallway lighting had obscured, and her expression, when she first looked at him, had a brief, unguarded quality that lasted perhaps half a second before it closed. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She came around the desk and leaned against it, which was not the configuration he'd expected. He'd expected the desk between them. Without it, the space felt oddly level. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. It was the kind of pause that in a lesser person would feel like strategy. In her it felt like assessment. "You fell asleep in a server room," she said. "You also fixed the intake filter that had been flagged for 6 weeks and ignored by 2 previous maintenance requests." He hadn't known about the previous requests. He said nothing. "Raymond Holt has submitted paperwork recommending termination," she continued. "I can sign it or I can set it aside. The policy supports both decisions." She paused. "Tell me why I should set it aside." Nathan looked at his hands, then at her. "I don't know that you should," he said. She blinked. It was a very small movement. "I was asleep on the job," he said. "That's the fact. Everything else, the context, the circumstances, that's real, but it doesn't change what the camera shows. If you're asking whether I can give you a reason to keep me on, the honest answer is, I do my job well when I'm here, and I'm here because I need to be, and that's not the same as a reason." The room was very quiet. The city beyond the glass moved in its distant, heatwave slow way. She studied him. "Do you need money?" she asked. The directness of it landed differently than he'd expected. Not unkind, just precise. "Yes," he said. "How much?" He sat with the question for a moment. It felt important to answer it accurately. "Enough to clear the urgent care bill and keep current on my daughter's prescription until the end of the month. Maybe $450. She nodded once, as if filing this away. Then she said, in a voice that had dropped to something quieter, but remained completely controlled, "What would you do for it?" He looked at her. "What are you willing to do?" She said, "To keep this job? Whatever the job requires. And if I asked for more than the job requires?" The air in the room changed. She had moved not much, perhaps half a step, but it shifted the geometry of the space between them. The morning light was behind her, angled, and her face was partly in shadow and partly in gold. And she was watching him with that dark, calibrated attention, and when she spoke again, her voice was nearly quiet. "What if I told you I could make the urgent care bill disappear? The prescription costs, the credit card. What if all of it could go away by the end of this week?" She let that settle. "What would you do for that?" He didn't answer immediately. He sat with the question, the way he sat with machinery that was making an unfamiliar sound, not moving until he understood what he was hearing. The room was very still. The city beyond the glass moved in its distant, indifferent way, and the summer heat pressed against the windows with that slow, inexorable weight that had characterized the entire last month. He thought about the credit card. He thought about Thursday's pediatrician appointment and the copay he'd been calculating. He thought about the window unit that had died in the night and the repair estimate that had come in at $420 and sat on his kitchen counter like an indictment. He thought about all of that and found, at the far end of it, that it didn't change the answer. The math was the math. But he was not only math. "I'll do anything for you," he said, and the words came out the way they were true, simply, without performance, with the weight of a man who had been doing the math for 3 years and had reached the end of the column. "Anything you need done, I'll do it. Longer hours, different responsibilities. Whatever you're actually asking." She leaned forward slightly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Even in bed?" The question hung in the room like heat lightning, the kind that illuminates without striking, that makes the whole sky briefly white. Nathan did not move. He sat with the question for what felt like a long time, and was probably 4 seconds. The orchid on the windowsill. The city shimmer. The sound of climate-controlled air moving through vents he could identify by their make and model because he had serviced them twice this spring. He looked at Alexandra Mercer. Her expression was the most complex thing he'd seen in years. Not triumphant, not predatory, but something colder than either. The look of a person running an experiment they've run before and already know the outcome of. She expected him to say yes. He could see it in the stillness of her face. The way she held herself at that half-step forward, not aggressive, but braced, as if she'd already absorbed the impact of whatever came next and was prepared to proceed through it. He thought of Lily, not strategically, not as a rhetorical device or a moral shield. He just thought of her the way you think of something real and true when everything else in the room is getting complicated. Her voice that morning. "We'll be okay, though." The way she'd said it, not as a question, not as comfort for him, but as a statement of fact that she'd already resolved inside herself. 8 years old, running a fever, eating buttered toast, and making her peace with the possibility of his unemployment. He thought of what she'd told him last spring, in the car, when he'd been particularly tired and had said something self-pitying about their circumstances that he'd immediately regretted. She'd looked at him with that level, old-soul expression and said, "Bah, I don't want stuff. I just want you to be the person you are." He didn't know where she'd gotten that. He thought it might have been a library book. He looked at Alexandra Mercer. "I can do most things," he said. His voice was quiet and steady and had none of the anger that he might have expected to find in it. "I've done hard things. I've done things I wasn't sure I could survive, and I survived them. But I can't do that." She didn't move. "Not because I'm proud," he continued. "Pride is a luxury I haven't been able to afford for a while. But because my daughter is going to look at me her whole life the way she looks at me now. And the only thing I have to give her that doesn't cost money is the kind of man I am." He stopped. "I can't sell that. I'm sorry." The last word surprised even him. He hadn't meant to apologize. But it wasn't sarcasm, and it wasn't weakness, it was something more accurate than either. He was sorry, in a specific way. Sorry that the world had apparently arranged itself such that this was the geometry they'd arrived at, in this glass room, on this overheated morning. He stood up. "Thank you for the meeting," he said. He walked to the door. Later, alone, Alexandra Mercer stood at the window and watched the city move. She had a thing she did when she needed to think clearly. She went absolutely still and let the thoughts organize themselves without interference. It was a discipline she'd developed early, out of necessity rather than intention, the way most of her disciplines had developed. She'd grown up in a mid-sized house in a mid-sized city, with parents who were present in the logistical sense. Meals were made, school fees were paid, but who had a talent for occupying a room without filling it. Her father worked long hours in insurance, a profession that had trained him to think about human beings primarily in terms of risk and liability. Her mother was social in the way of someone who performs warmth so consistently that it becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. They were not unkind people. They had simply never learned to be present in the particular way that children need, which is not the same as being there. Alexandra had learned to be self-sufficient by age 10 in the way that children do when they understand, without anyone saying it directly, that they are largely on their own in the interior rooms of their life. She'd understood by middle school that achievement was a reliable currency, that straight A's and academic prizes generated a specific kind of parental attention that felt close enough to love to serve as its substitute. She'd built her life around this understanding, built and built, until the building had become impressive enough that she could live inside it indefinitely. She'd been good at school because school had rules, and rules were reliable, and reliability was the thing she'd organized her entire interior life around. She'd been better at strategy than at feeling, which was not a lack she'd been aware of until much later. At 24, she'd met a man named Garrett. Garrett was brilliant and attentive and had a particular gift for making her feel, for the first time in her memory, like she was someone worth looking at. Not her accomplishments, her. He'd had the ability to sit across from her at a dinner table and focus on her with a quality of attention that she'd found, at the time, overwhelming in its completeness. She'd loved him in the way of a person who has saved something up for a long time, without knowing it all at once, with a totality that left her exposed in ways she hadn't understood she was capable of being exposed. She'd trusted him with things she hadn't told anyone else. Small things, mostly the childhood memories she'd never packaged into anecdotes, the specific flavors of her loneliness, the way she sometimes woke at 3 in the morning with the precise anxiety of a child waiting to hear whether she'd done enough. He'd listened to all of it with the focused attention that had made her love him, and she'd believed, for the first time in years, that she didn't have to manage the distance between herself and another person. He'd borrowed money over 3 years. Gradually, almost imperceptibly the way a leak works, not a flood. Small amounts at first, then larger. Always with reasons that made sense in isolation. A business venture that needed seed capital. A family obligation he was embarrassed about, an investment opportunity with a closing window. She'd had money by then. She'd been 3 years into a career that was already accelerating past people twice her age. The amounts hadn't hurt in any financial way. That wasn't the point. The point was that when she'd finally understood what had been happening, not from confronting him but from an accountant's report that she'd ordered on a different matter and that had illuminated the pattern, she'd been too close to see he hadn't apologized. He'd explained. He'd been remarkably calm about it. Seated across from her in the same restaurant where he'd first told her she was interesting. And he'd told her that she was smart enough to have known, on some level, and had chosen not to, that her preference for the comfortable interpretation was her responsibility, not his. He'd said it without cruelty, with a kind of clinical even-handedness, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. She'd sat very still through the whole conversation. She hadn't cried. She'd driven home afterward and sat in her car in the garage for 40 minutes, doing what she was doing now at the window, going completely still and letting the information organize itself. What organized itself was a conviction that took the place of the grief she'd expected to feel and hadn't. That she had been naive in a specific and correctable way. That the thing she'd mistaken for love was simply a transaction she hadn't priced accurately at the outset. That everyone, including herself, was operating from some calculus of exchange, and that the error was in believing otherwise. She'd believed, after that, in a specific geometry, that everyone had a price, and that the price was the truth of them, and that love, or what people called love, was simply the process of discovering what it was before it cost you too much. She'd tested this belief many times since, in smaller and larger ways, in business and in the careful, limited personal relationships she'd permitted herself in the years since. It had always been confirmed. Until this morning. She pressed her fingers to the glass. It was warm. The whole city was warm. She thought about the way he'd looked at her, not with outrage, not with injured dignity, but with a kind of calm that she recognized. Now that she was watching it from a distance, as something she'd spent 20 years trying to construct in herself and hadn't managed to replicate. The stillness of someone who has already paid for what they believe and found the price acceptable. She thought about the word sorry. She'd expected defiance. She'd gotten honesty. It was an extremely uncomfortable distinction. She picked up her phone. Set it down. Picked it up again. She did not call anyone. She stood at the window for a long time. Nathan drove the familiar route home through the middle of the afternoon, which meant the heat was at its peak. The asphalt soft, the air above it visibly warped, the radio weather segment cheerfully reporting that there would be no change for at least another week. He didn't know if he still had a job. He'd left the building without stopping at Raymond's office or the HR desk or any of the intermediate stops that protocol would have suggested. He'd gone through the lobby, through the glass doors, across the parking lot, into his truck, out of the lot. He'd driven for 10 minutes before he'd noticed that he was going home instead of going anywhere purposeful, and had decided this was probably correct. He was, he realized, very tired. Not the surface tiredness of a bad night, though, that too, but something older. The tiredness of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has become so accustomed to the weight that they've forgotten it isn't something everyone carries. The kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep, that requires something the opposite of effort. He stopped at the pharmacy to pick up the second prescription. The urgent care doctor had called in a pediatric antibiotic supplement that his mother had texted him about, and stood in the line and looked at the fluorescent lights and felt, very briefly, the specific texture of despair that comes not from catastrophe but from accumulation, from the understanding that tomorrow will look a great deal like today, and the day after that likewise, and that this is simply the arithmetic of your life and there is no cavalry coming. Then the pharmacist called his name, and he went to the window. And she was a woman named Donna, who had filled Lily's prescriptions before, and who asked how Lily was doing with a warmth that was entirely unperformed, and he said she was getting better, and Donna said good, and the moment passed. But something in the simplicity of it, the ordinary human texture of it, loosened something in his chest. He paid. He got back in the truck. His mother was in the apartment when he got home, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and Lily was on the couch watching a nature documentary with the focused attention she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. She looked up when he came in. She looked better. The fever flush was gone from her cheeks. "How was the meeting?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet." She nodded in that measuring way she had. "Did you get fired?" "I don't know, but you didn't do anything wrong." He sat down on the edge of the coffee table across from her. "It's more complicated than that." She thought about this. Sometimes things are complicated and still turn out okay. "That's very wise," he said. "I read it in a book about turtles." He laughed, a real one, sudden, from the bottom of his chest. She smiled in the satisfied way she smiled when she'd made him do that. He looked at her for a moment, her face in the afternoon light, the slope of her shoulder under the blanket. He thought, whatever else, this is the thing I will not trade. He got a call from an HR administrator the following morning. The call informed him that his position at Voss Technologies was being retained, that his personnel file would reflect a written warning for the server room incident, that Raymond Holt had been transferred to a different department, which was not stated as a consequence of anything but simply as an organizational update, that his maintenance responsibilities were being expanded to include the 6th floor. He stood in the kitchen while Lily ate breakfast and listened to all of this. He said, "I understand. Thank you." He hung up. He stood at the window for a moment. Outside, the summer was doing exactly what it had been doing. Heat, brightness, the steady pressure of it all. He didn't know what Alexandra Mercer had done, or decided, or why. He didn't call to ask. It wasn't his information to pursue. What he did know, what arrived over the next 2 weeks as a series of small, factual events, was this. The urgent care bill was resolved by a charitable care fund through the hospital's financial assistance program, a program that Nathan had not applied to and for which someone had apparently submitted paperwork on his behalf. He couldn't prove who. He didn't try. Lily's pediatrician called on a Thursday afternoon to say that a billing adjustment had been applied to their account and that the outstanding balance had been cleared. The pediatrician seemed to find this unremarkable, which suggested the call had come from the administrative side. And on a Friday, 2 weeks after the meeting in the glass office, Nathan was replacing a light fixture on the 6th floor when he passed the corner office and saw, through the glass, Alexandra Mercer at her desk. She was on a call, her back half turned to the room. She did not see him, or perhaps she did. He thought, briefly, that her shoulders had changed in some way he couldn't define precisely. Something in the set of them slightly less braced, slightly less constructed. The way a building looks after the scaffolding comes down. He could have been wrong. He was not an expert in her. He finished the light fixture. He went back downstairs. A month after the summer's worst week, Nathan took Lily to the park. This was unremarkable in every surface detail. A Tuesday evening. A park 2 blocks from their apartment. The same park they'd been going to since she was small enough to need the low swings. The heat had finally broken. Though broken was perhaps too dramatic a word for what had happened, which was more like a gradual resignation, the temperature dropping into the low 80s, the humidity retreating to a level that no longer felt like a physical obstacle, the whole city exhaling something it had been holding since June. The evenings were starting to carry something cooler in them, a first suggestion of the season that came after this one. The light was different, too less vertical, less punishing, coming in at an angle now that gave things back their shadows. Lily ran ahead of him on the path with the energy of a child who had been horizontal for too many consecutive days and had opinions about it. She wore her green sneakers, and her hair was loose, and she was carrying a stick she'd found at the park entrance that was approximately twice as tall as she was, and which she had apparently decided was essential. She found a beetle on the path and stopped to examine it with the total, unhurried focus she brought to things she found worth examining. Nathan watched her crouch down, the stick set aside, her face close to the ground, utterly unself-conscious. She didn't look up or ask him to come see. She trusted the beetle to be interesting enough on its own merits, and that he would come when he was ready. He sat on a bench. He watched her. He was still at Voss Technologies. He was still driving evenings on Thursday and Friday. He was still calculating the gap every night before sleep. Though the gap had narrowed slightly in the past month, the urgent care debt resolved by mechanisms he hadn't pursued, the prescription costs manageable now that the infection had cleared, a small overtime bonus from the expanded sixth-floor responsibilities that he had accepted because it was work, and work was what he did. The math had not changed in any dramatic way. The arithmetic of his life was still his arithmetic, but something in him was different, and he'd been trying to locate what it was precisely in the way he located problems in machinery by process of elimination. By feeling for where the resistance was, he thought he'd found it, finally, sitting on this bench. The meeting in the glass office had offered him something and he'd refused it, and in the refusing he had become, in some way he hadn't anticipated, more precisely himself. It was not a triumphant feeling. There was nothing triumphant about it. He hadn't saved anyone. He hadn't fixed anything. He just answered a question about what he was made of when the pressure was high enough, and the answer had been the answer he would have hoped for, and he had lived with that answer since and found that it held. It was like knowing the load capacity of a structure you live inside. You hope, when you build it, that the numbers are right. You only know for certain when the weight arrives. He didn't think about this as a victory. Victory would have required a different kind of story, with a different architecture. This was just a life continuing, imperfect, managed day by day by a man who had decided, in a glass room in the middle of a long summer, what he was worth. The same thing he'd always been worth. No more, no less. The summer had not changed the value. It had only confirmed it. He looked up. Across the park, on a bench on the far side of the gravel path, a woman was sitting alone. She was not looking at a phone. She was watching the tree line at the edge of the park with an expression that was, even at this distance, recognizable as something private, the face of a person who has come somewhere specifically to not be performing anything. She was wearing jeans and a light jacket, and her hair was down, which was the detail that struck him first, because he had only ever seen it pulled back. Without that architecture, she looked younger than he'd have expected, less assembled, more like a person who was figuring something out. Nathan looked at Alexandra Mercer across the park for a moment. Then he looked back at his daughter. He didn't stand. He didn't wave. He didn't cross the path. Whatever she was doing in this park, on this cooling Tuesday evening, in ordinary clothes with no assistant and no tablet and no professional perimeter around her, was not something she'd arranged to be witnessed. He understood this without analysis. Lily looked up from the beetle and found him with her eyes. "Bah! Come see." He walked over. He crouched beside her in the gravel path and looked at what she was looking at, a beetle. Iridescent, green-black, moving with deliberate patience across a leaf. "Remarkable," he said. "It has iridescent spots," she told him. "That means the color comes from microscopic structures in the shell, not from pigment. So it reflects light differently depending on the angle you look at it." "Where'd you read that?" "Book about beetles." "Of course." She watched the beetle move to the edge of the leaf and pause, apparently reconsidering its direction. she said without looking up. Do you think the beetle knows it's beautiful? He thought about this seriously because she was asking seriously. I don't think so. I think it just knows it's a beetle. She nodded. That's probably better. He looked at her profile. The clean line of her jaw, the serious set of her mouth, the total absorption she brought to small things. He thought about the library books she read by the stackful, the questions she asked that sometimes stopped him mid-sentence because he hadn't thought of asking them himself, the way she moved through the world with that particular combination of wonder and practicality that seemed to him the best possible way to move through it. He thought, there are things that can't be bought. He'd known this abstractly for years. It was the kind of thing you knew without testing. The way you know that a bridge is load-bearing before you drive across it. But he knew it differently now. The way you know something after you've been asked to price it, and named the price, and found out the price was something you still had. He didn't look back across the park. When he finally stood and turned, the bench on the far side was empty. He stood for a moment in the cooling evening, his daughter at work on the ground beside him, the trees at the edge of the park moving in the first good breeze of the season. The light was doing the particular thing it did in late summer, coming in low and copper-colored, laying itself across ordinary objects, the path, the grass, the park bench, his daughter's hair, and making them briefly, improbably beautiful in the way that ordinary things become beautiful when the angle is right, he thought. There are things that can't be bought. He'd known this abstractly for years. He knew it differently now, the way you know something after you've been asked to price it and said no and found out the price was something you still had. He didn't think about this as a victory. Victory would have required a different kind of story, with a different architecture. This was just a life continuing, imperfect, managed day by day by a man who had decided, in a glass room in the middle of a long summer, what he was worth. The same thing he'd always been worth. No more, no less. Lily came back to the bench and sat beside him, leaning against his arm with the comfortable weight of absolute trust. Can we get ice cream? She asked. He checked his wallet in his head. He had $23. Yeah, he said. We can get ice cream. They walked out of the park together in the low copper light, his daughter's hand in his, both of them moving toward something as ordinary and specific as a Tuesday evening, which was, he had come to understand, the same thing as everything. Somewhere across the city, in an apartment that was too large and too quiet, a woman sat at a window with a glass of water and looked at nothing in particular, and thought about a man who had refused her, and felt, for the first time in a long time, the peculiar discomfort of being seen clearly. She didn't know what to do with it yet. That was all right. She had time.